Let me explain something that most people never tell you the truth about. We talk a lot about love, effort, and loyalty, but nobody talks enough about timing, energy, and self-respect. And especially, nobody explains what really happens when you stop chasing someone you care about. See, chasing feels like love. It feels like effort. It feels like if I just do a little more, say a little more, give a little more, he'll finally see my value. But the truth is, the human mind doesn't work the way your heart does. And when you stop chasing him, something very specific starts happening inside his mind. Not immediately, not loudly, but deeply. Let's talk about that. When you stop chasing him, the first and most important shift happens in the area of value. And value is not something the heart understands naturally. It is something the human mind calculates. People don't consciously sit down and assign worth to another person, but the brain is constantly measuring effort, availability, and emotional accessibility. When you were chasing, your attention was consistent, predictable, and easily accessible. And while that may feel like love, the mind interprets constant availability very differently than the heart does. The mind starts to associate what is always present with what is common, and what is common rarely feels urgent. Human psychology is deeply influenced by scarcity. Anything that feels limited, uncertain, or at risk of being lost instantly gains importance. This is why people value time more when it's running out, opportunities more when they're rare, and relationships more when access is no longer guaranteed. When you stop chasing, you introduce scarcity, not artificially, but naturally. Your attention is no longer on demand. Your emotional energy is no longer being poured out without resistance. And the mind responds to that shift immediately, even if the person doesn't consciously recognize it. At first, his mind doesn't label it as value. It labels it as missing. Something feels off. The rhythm has changed. The familiar emotional supply is no longer flowing the same way. And because the human brain dislikes disruption, it tries to restore balance by asking questions. Why did she stop? Did something change? Did I do something wrong? Is she pulling away, or is she moving on? These questions don't come from romance at first. They come from discomfort. But discomfort is the doorway to awareness. While you were chasing, there was no need for his mind to evaluate your worth because your effort was doing the convincing for him. The brain didn't have to invest energy in wondering, imagining, or reflecting. But once you stop, the mental workload shifts to him. Now his mind has to process the absence. And in doing so, it begins comparing before and after. This comparison is where value is recalculated. He starts remembering how consistently you showed up, how available you were, how forgiving, how patient. Not because you reminded him, but because your absence highlights what used to exist. The mind understands contrast far better than explanation. You could explain your value 1,000 times while chasing, and it wouldn't land the same way silence does when it creates contrast. Scarcity also activates curiosity. When someone is no longer trying to win approval, the question becomes, what changed? And that question often leads to another much deeper one. What did I assume would always be there? This is where entitlement begins to crack. Not always completely, not always immediately, but enough to cause internal reflection. The mind realizes that access to you was not guaranteed by default. It was maintained by your effort. And when that effort stops, the mind has to acknowledge that effort had meaning. Another important psychological layer here is that the brain values what it has to work for. When someone doesn't chase, they are no longer over-functioning emotionally. That forces the other person to either step forward or sit with the discomfort of inaction. Either way, the mind is engaged, and engagement is necessary for desire to grow. Chasing removes the need for engagement because everything is already being provided. When you stop chasing, you are no longer signaling need. And need, while human, often lowers perceived value in the early stages of emotional imbalance. The brain confuses need with dependency and dependency with predictability. But when you pull back, you signal self-sufficiency. You communicate without words that your life continues, your emotions are regulated, and your worth does not depend on being chosen in that moment. That signal is powerful because it contradicts the assumption that you would always be there waiting. This is also where respect begins to either form or fade. The mind respects what respects itself. When you stop chasing, you demonstrate boundaries without confrontation. You show that your energy has limits, and limits are what define value. Without limits, there is no urgency, no priority, no appreciation. The brain doesn't rush to protect what it believes will never leave. Over time, this shift in value forces a decision. Either he recognizes the scarcity and steps into effort, or he avoids the discomfort and rationalizes the loss. But in both cases, the recalculation has already happened. He now understands on a psychological level that your presence was not accidental and your absence is not meaningless. And that is the quiet power of stopping the chase. You don't convince the mind of your value. You allow the mind to discover it on its own. When you stop chasing him, silence becomes the loudest thing in his mind. And this is where the ego begins to respond. Not in a dramatic, emotional way at first, but in a slow, unsettling way that disrupts his sense of comfort. The ego thrives on certainty. It likes knowing where it stands, what it can access, and what it can rely on without effort. When you were present, responsive, and emotionally available, his ego felt secure, not necessarily because he was deeply invested, but because the situation required very little self-examination from him. Silence removes that security, and the masculine ego especially struggles with unanswered space. When there is no message to reply to, no reassurance to receive, and no emotional cues to lean on, the mind starts creating its own narrative. This is where overthinking begins, not because he suddenly wants to analyze emotions, but because the ego feels challenged. It begins asking questions that were never necessary before. Why isn't she reaching out? Why hasn't she checked in? Is she upset or is she done? These questions don't come from vulnerability at first. They come from a disrupted sense of control. Ego is closely tied to validation. When you were chasing, your attention functioned as confirmation that he mattered, that he was wanted, that he had emotional influence over you. That validation became part of his mental environment, like background noise he didn't consciously notice but expected to always be there. When you stop, the absence of that validation feels like a withdrawal. The ego doesn't interpret this as she's giving me space. It interprets it as something has changed about how I am being perceived. And that creates internal tension. This tension leads to mental replay. The mind starts revisiting past interactions, not with emotional depth at first, but with self-protective curiosity. He rethinks conversations, messages, and moments where he may have been distant or dismissive, not necessarily out of guilt, but because the ego wants to identify what caused the shift. Silence forces reflection because there is no longer immediate feedback to rely on. And when the ego doesn't get feedback, it turns inward. Another important effect of silence is that it removes emotional cushioning. When someone is always present, always explaining, always smoothing things over, the ego never has to sit with discomfort. But when you stop chasing, discomfort has nowhere to go. It lingers, it shows up in small ways: restlessness, distraction, checking the phone without reason, feeling slightly irritated without knowing why. These are signs of an ego that has lost its familiar reinforcement. Silence also removes the opportunity for him to perform minimal effort and still feel desired. When chasing stops, the ego realizes that low investment no longer guarantees emotional reward. That realization can be deeply unsettling because it exposes imbalance. The mind begins to notice that the dynamic has shifted from being centered around him to being undefined, and undefined situations are uncomfortable for the ego because they require either action or acceptance. At this stage, pride often clashes with curiosity. Part of the ego wants to reach out to test whether the connection still exists. Another part resists, not wanting to appear vulnerable or rejected. This internal conflict keeps the mind busy. He may tell himself stories to protect his ego. She's just busy. She'll come back. This is temporary. But the silence continues, and those stories start to lose strength. The longer the quiet lasts, the harder it becomes to dismiss its meaning. Silence also strips away assumptions. The ego often assumes that effort will always be met with patience, that distance will always be tolerated, and that emotional availability will remain unchanged. When those assumptions are challenged, the ego is forced to update its beliefs. One of the most unsettling realizations for the ego is the possibility that someone may have stopped trying not out of anger, but out of clarity. That possibility suggests independence, and independence is threatening to an ego that was comfortable being central. Over time, the ego begins to feel something close to doubt, not just about the relationship, but about itself. Am I as important as I thought? Did I misjudge my place in her life? Was I too passive? These thoughts are subtle, but they mark a shift from entitlement to awareness. And awareness is where change either begins or resistance hardens. What makes silence so powerful is that it doesn't argue, accuse, or explain. It doesn't give the ego anything to push against. There is no conflict to win, no justification to defend, just space. And in that space, the ego has to confront the possibility that attention is not guaranteed and connection is not automatic. By stopping the chase, you don't attack the ego. You disengage from feeding it. And when the ego is no longer being fed, it has no choice but to notice. When you stop chasing him, one of the most profound changes that takes place is the shift in emotional ownership. Before this moment, the emotional responsibility of the connection rested almost entirely on you. You were the one initiating conversations, checking in, smoothing misunderstandings, and keeping the emotional flow alive. Without realizing it, you carried the weight of maintaining the bond. And when one person carries all the emotional labor, the other rarely understands the true cost of the connection. Emotional ownership refers to who feels responsible for the state of the relationship. While you were chasing, he didn't have to think deeply about where things were going or how they felt. The relationship existed because you were actively sustaining it. When you stop chasing, that support is removed. The emotional structure that was being held up by your effort suddenly stands on its own. And for the first time, he has to feel what happens when no one is managing the emotional environment for him. This shift is uncomfortable because emotional weight doesn't disappear, it transfers. When you step back, the feelings that were once absorbed, softened, or redirected by your presence now land directly on him. He begins to notice the silence, the lack of reassurance, the absence of emotional cues that once guided him. Without someone filling in the gaps, his mind is forced to sit with uncertainty, and uncertainty creates awareness. At first, he may not label this as emotional responsibility. It simply feels heavier. There is a subtle sense that something is unresolved, that something is unfinished. He may find himself thinking about you at unexpected moments, not out of romance at first, but because the mind seeks closure when emotional loops are left open. When you were chasing, you closed those loops by following up, explaining, and reconnecting. Now the loops remain open, and his mind has to process them alone. This is where emotional maturity is tested. Some people respond by leaning into the weight. They reflect, evaluate, and consider what they truly feel and what they are willing to do. Others avoid the weight by distracting themselves, minimizing the connection, or convincing themselves that it didn't matter. But avoidance itself is still a response to emotional ownership. The difference is whether the person accepts or rejects the responsibility. Another critical change is that he can no longer outsource emotional reassurance. When you were present, your effort reassured him that the connection was safe and stable, even if he wasn't contributing equally. That reassurance allowed him to remain passive. But when you stop chasing, reassurance disappears. And without reassurance, the mind becomes alert. It starts asking questions it never needed to ask before. Where do I stand? What does this mean? What do I actually want? This internal questioning is significant because it marks the moment where feelings become personal rather than relational. Instead of reacting to your behavior, he is now reacting to his own emotions. Begins to feel the absence not because you demanded something, but because he feels it himself. That distinction matters. Desire that arises from internal awareness is far more meaningful than desire triggered by pressure or persuasion. Emotional ownership also changes the power dynamic. When you were chasing, power leaned toward the person being pursued because effort was coming from one side. Stepping back restores balance. You are no longer managing outcomes or anticipating responses. You allow space for natural consequence. And natural consequence is what teaches the mind what truly matters. As this process unfolds, he may begin to recognize how much of the emotional connection depended on you. This realization can be subtle and delayed, but it often shows up as appreciation in hindsight. He starts noticing that conversations feel emptier, that the emotional warmth he once felt is missing, not because something new was taken away, but because something he relied on is no longer being provided. This is also where accountability becomes unavoidable. Without your presence buffering the experience, he must face his own level of investment. If he wants connection, he has to create it. If he wants clarity, he has to seek it. If he wants reassurance, he has to offer something in return. Emotional ownership means recognizing that relationships do not sustain themselves. They respond to participation. For you, stopping the chase is an act of self-respect, but psychologically, it is also an invitation for the other person to step into adulthood within the connection. Whether or not he accepts that invitation determines the outcome. But the important truth is this: once emotional ownership shifts, the dynamic can never fully return to what it was. By stepping back, you release yourself from carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be yours alone. And in doing so, you give him the opportunity to feel what connection actually requires. When you stop chasing him, something very important happens beneath the surface that most people misunderstand. What awakens is not manipulation, fear, or control, but genuine desire. Desire cannot be forced, argued into existence, or maintained through constant effort. It grows only when there is freedom, space, and emotional safety. When chasing is present, desire often becomes confused with pressure. When chasing ends, desire finally has room to breathe. Chasing creates noise. It fills every gap with explanation, reassurance, and emotional availability. While that may feel loving, it also leaves no room for curiosity. The mind does not long for what is always within reach. When everything is accessible, there is nothing to imagine. But when you detach with dignity, silence replaces noise, and that silence invites thought. Thought invites feeling, and feeling is where real desire begins. Detachment is not coldness, it is emotional balance. When you stop chasing, you are not punishing or withdrawing love. You are allowing the connection to exist without being carried by force. This changes how you are perceived. Instead of being someone who needs validation, you become someone who chooses connection only when it is mutual. That distinction is powerful because desire is drawn toward choice, not obligation. As space is created, his mind begins to revisit moments naturally, not because he is pushed to, but because he wants to understand what he feels. He may remember laughter, conversations, or emotional closeness with a new lens. These memories now stand alone without being followed by immediate contact. And when memory exists without reinforcement, it often grows stronger. The absence allows emotion to echo. Another critical element of detachment is that it removes performance. When you are chasing, interactions may have been influenced by fear of loss, overthinking, or the desire to maintain closeness. When you step back, you are no longer performing for approval. You return to authenticity. And authenticity is deeply attractive because it signals emotional stability and self-respect. Detachment also shifts desire from ego-based to connection-based. Ego-driven desire is about possession, control, and validation. It wants to know it is wanted. But connection-based desire is about emotional resonance. It wants to feel understood, aligned, and inspired. When chasing stops, ego loses its constant validation. And what remains is the question of true interest. That question cannot be answered by effort. It can only be answered by feeling. This is why detachment often leads to increased attention or renewed effort from the other person. Not because they are being manipulated, but because their internal world has changed. They are no longer responding to pursuit, they are responding to absence. And absence reveals emotional truth. If there is genuine desire, it surfaces. If there is not, it fades. Either outcome brings clarity. Another overlooked aspect is that detachment restores polarity. Emotional attraction thrives on balance. When one person overgives, the dynamic becomes uneven. The overgiver loses emotional grounding, and the receiver loses appreciation. Stepping back restores equilibrium. You are no longer overfunctioning, and the other person must either step up or step away. Polarity creates energy. Energy fuels desire. Detachment also allows him to experience what life feels like without your emotional presence. This experience is crucial because people rarely value what they have until they feel its absence. When you were chasing, he never had to confront that absence. Now he does. And that confrontation can awaken longing, not for attention, but for connection. Importantly, detachment protects you regardless of the outcome. If desire grows, it grows organically without pressure or resentment. If it doesn't, you are already grounded in self-respect. You are no longer emotionally invested in convincing someone to choose you. That freedom is not only healthy, it is magnetic. True desire arises when two people choose each other freely, not when one tries to secure the other through effort alone. By stepping back, you allow the relationship to reveal its truth. You allow desire to either deepen or dissolve naturally. And in doing so, you honor both your worth and the emotional integrity of the connection. Stopping the chase is not about losing someone. It is about creating the conditions where genuine desire can finally exist. And here is the deeper truth that settles everything into place. When you stop chasing him, you finally stop abandoning yourself. You stop measuring your worth by how quickly someone responds, how often they choose you, or how much effort you can give without receiving the same in return. You step out of emotional survival mode and into emotional strength. And that shift changes not just how he may see you, but how you see yourself. At that moment, the connection is no longer being held together by fear, hope, or effort alone. It is placed in the hands of reality. Reality does not bend to begging or overgiving. Reality responds only to truth. And the truth is simple. Anything meant for you will meet you halfway without needing to be chased. If he feels the absence and steps forward with clarity, intention, and consistency, then what grows from there has a solid foundation. It grows from choice, not pressure, from desire, not dependency. And that kind of connection doesn't drain you, it strengthens you. But if he remains distant, distracted, or unchanged, then the silence has still done its job. It has protected you from investing more time, energy, and emotion into something that could not sustain you. It has saved you from confusing attachment with love and effort with compatibility. Stopping the chase does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop carrying the relationship alone. It means you trust that love does not require self-betrayal to survive. And in that trust, you regain peace, confidence, and emotional balance. Because the real victory is not whether someone comes back. It's that you no longer lose yourself trying to be chosen. And from that place of wholeness, whatever comes next will finally be worthy of you.